Good evening. My name is Daniel Rothenberg. I co-direct the Future Security Initiative, which is a partnership between Arizona State University, School of Politics and Global Studies, and New America, a DC-based think tank. So this is the first event in our first speaker series as the Future Security Initiative. For those who are familiar with our previous entity, we were the Center on the Future of War. So we run all sorts of speaker series, a fall semester and spring semester series, and we're thrilled to have all of you here with us tonight to hear a presentation from Scott Shapiro, who's the Charles F. Southmayd Professor of Law and Professor of Philosophy at Yale Law School. His areas of interest include jurisprudence, international law, constitutional law, criminal law, and cybersecurity. He's the author of Legality, The Internationalists, which he wrote with Oona Hathaway, a colleague at Yale Law School, and the editor of the Oxford Handbook of Jurisprudence and Philosophy of Law with Jules Coleman. He's also the founding director of the Yale CyberSecurity Lab, which provides cutting-edge cybersecurity information and technology teaching facilities. And his new book is called Fancy Bear Goes Phishing. This is what he's going to be speaking about today. And the subtitle is The Dark History of the Information Age in 5 Extraordinary Hacks. So thank you so much for joining us today. And also special thanks to Tony Roth, who is our new senior coordinator, and also to Alexander Bice, who's helping us, and Kayla Starney. And I will turn over the floor to Scott. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, thank you so much, Daniel, for the invitation. It's really great. Well, I would say to be here, but I'm actually not there. So, but it's great that I get to talk about my new book, Fancy Bear Goes Phishing. Before I start, let me just explain the title, Fancy Bear Goes Phishing. So Fancy Bear is the code name that was given by the cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike to one of the elite hacking units at the GRU, which is Russian military intelligence. Phishing, I'm sure you all know, is sending fraudulent emails from presumably reputable people in order to elicit confidential information. Spear phishing is like phishing, but targeted. And whaling is spear phishing, where you go after some like really, really high value target. And that's what I'm going to talk about right now, which was one of the great whalings in cybersecurity history, and in fact, one of the greatest screw ups in cybersecurity history, which I'll talk about in a second. What I'd like to, the book, Fancy Bear Goes Phishing, it talks about 5 hacks. The fourth is the hack of the DNC, and since this is the future, what formerly known as the Future of War, now Future Security Initiative, I thought I would talk about this because it raises a lot of issues about larger geopolitical questions involving cybersecurity. So many of you will remember that the GRU, Fancy Bear, the Russians, hacked John Podesta on March 19th, 11:59 in the AM, Moscow time. Fancy Bear sent out this phishing email, said, "Hi, John, somebody just used your password to sign into your Google account. Details," says what the date, the putative time, the IP address, and location, Ukraine. And Google stopped the sign-in attempt. You should change your password immediately. And there was a change password button down there. If you hovered over the button, it would send it. It would show you a bit.ly shortened URL. But if you expanded the URL, you would see this kind of very long URL. And this is what's known as typo squatting. That is, if you look over here, it's instead of it says accounts, it says accounts. And it was designed to trick John Podesta into changing his Gmail account, so that he would enter his credentials into a server controlled by Fancy Bear. So he did the responsible thing. which was he sent the message over to IT. He, at the time, was the chairperson for Hillary for America, Hillary Clinton's campaign. And Charles Delavan, who was the head of IT for Hillary for America, wrote back. Sarah, was John Podesta's chief of staff. This is a legitimate email. John needs to change his password immediately and ensure that two-factor authentication is turned on his account. Now, it turns out that that this was not a legitimate email. This was, Delavan claims, was a typo. He meant to write, this is an, well, first he said, I meant to write, this is an illegitimate account email, which doesn't quite work, because if he meant to type illegitimate, it should have been, this is an legitimate email. But then later on, he told the New York Times that actually he meant to write, this is not a legitimate email. And because of this mistake, John Podesta gave the Russians his Gmail account, and they quickly siphoned off 50,000 of his emails, including the great national security secret of his shrimp risotto recipe. Okay. One of the reasons why I was interested in writing about Fancy Bear, John Podesta, hack of the DNC, not only because it happened at the time I started writing the book, and also was so consequential for the United States, but also I was just really interested, like, how could have this happened? Not like a mistake in an email. People make mistakes in emails all the time, but as will become clear, there were a lot of seeming missteps, both by the FBI and the Democratic National Committee, and it made it seem as if nobody could shoot straight, that the FBI was irresponsible, that the DNC was irresponsible. And the message I want to get across to you today was that actually everyone acted rationally. I mean, Delavan made an error, and I think he was telling the truth for reasons which become clear as I talk. But I think everyone was basically acting rationally and responsibly. What really was the problem is that we have a very kooky set of national security laws. So let me just, before I go and tell more about the hack of the DNC and how Fancy Bear did it, let me talk a bit about the philosophy of cybersecurity. Okay, for most people tend to think that cybersecurity, hacking's obviously a technical activity, so it just seems like cybersecurity is a technical problem, and in order to solve a technical problem, you need engineering solutions. And in Fancy Bear, I argued that this is a very misguided approach, that really cybersecurity is a set of human problems that require human solutions. Now, let me see if I can make this a bit more precise by introducing a distinction, okay? A distinction between upcode and downcode. Okay, those are my words, upcode and downcode. So imagine you're at your computer terminal, all the code below your fingertips, that's downcode. All the code above your fingertips, that's upcode. Downcode is run by computers, that's your computer code. Upcode are the norms and rules that are run by humans. Here are examples of downcode, microcode, binary applications, your operating system, drivers, firmwares, all the kind of stuff, all the technical stuff that either you love or you hate. But that's the downcode. People speak less about upcode. There are lots of varieties of upcode. You can actually think of upcode as forming a stack, just like as in people talk about the downcode stack. Upcode also has a stack. So first, there's psychological rules that we all follow. System 1, System 2, what Daniel Kahneman called thinking fast and slow. Our personal ethics, habits, rituals, plans, projects, their economic upcode, terms of service from websites, employment contracts, property rules, organizational, industrial, social norms, and of course, legal rules. That's among the most important upcode that human beings have, is the rules that were created by various legal systems, either domestic or international. Um, the, uh, the main claim that I make in the book, or one of the main claims I make in the book, is that when we think about cybersecurity, we should not be thinking about downcode. We should be thinking about upcode. That upcode is privileged over downcode because downcode is causally downstream from upcode. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that if you buy software from somebody, from a company, that company, the developers, they didn't find it in nature. They were following various incentives given to them by various types of upcodes. So developer went to work because they have a work ethic. And they get paid because they have an employment contract, and their company is able to pay them because their intellectual property rules, which say that they own the software that is created. So the point is that there are all these kinds of norms that create incentives for developers to create certain kinds of code, and also for users to consume types of code. And I'll show you what I mean as we go further. But the point is that if you try to solve the insecurity in our computer systems by always fixing the downcode, you're always too late, because by the time you're fixing the downcode, everything, all the operations of norms and incentives have given the developers the reason to create bad downcode. So it's far better to fix the vulnerabilities in the upcode than wait till the mistakes have been made and then fix it in the downcode. The second reason is that upcode creates the data used by downcode. And what do I mean by that? Let's say somebody tells you, here's an operating system which is just no hacker could ever get into. This is bulletproof. Now, we know for theoretical reasons there can be no such operating system, but let's just assume it. Okay. Let's say your enterprise, your school, your work installs this operating system. No hacker can get into it. Hacker walks into your business, goes up to IT and says, "Hi, I'm the CEO's assistant. Please give me their credentials." They hand it over. Well, this is obviously very bad corporate upcode, and it also completely defeats the whole purpose of having bulletproof downcode. So you really need to be focusing on the upcode as opposed to the downcode, and that's the message that I would like to impart today. And I'd like to exemplify the primacy and the importance of upcode by telling the Fancy Bear story. Okay, so let me just quickly go through the timeline of what happened, how Fancy Bear got into the DNC. On March 10th, Fancy Bear started sending out phishing emails to Hillary for America. Now, Hillary for America is Hillary's campaign. The DNC is that's a different organization. They work together, but one's a campaign. The other one helps, the DNC is, runs, organizes, administers the Democratic Party. So these are different entities. So first, Fancy Bear goes after Hillary for America. They're unsuccessful in part because they don't actually know anybody at Hillary for America. They scrape the web and they get all the people who worked at Hillary for Hillary. I forgot what the name was, but in 2008. But they seem to have gotten one person who also was working at 2008 and 2016. So they seem to have gotten some information because they send more phishing emails to Hillary for America. But one of the things and one of the great ironies about the story is that Hillary for America, Hillary's campaign was really battened down, really hardened. They had excellent cybersecurity for all the talk about, but her emails. They used two-factor authentication. They got rid of emails after 30 days. They had really good cybersecurity. So Fancy Bear can't get into Hillary for America. So what they decide to do, and then they send more phishing emails to Hillary for America, and they're really not getting anywhere. So then they have the bright idea, which was very smart, which was to go after personal emails. So this is when they, on March 19th, they send the phishing email to John Podesta's personal Gmail. And they get in, as I described at the beginning of the talk, get 50,000 emails, and they're pretty happy about that. And then they start sending more phishing emails to different personal Gmail accounts of high-ranking campaign officials, Huma Abedin, Ravi Mook. They don't get any, but they do get one guy, Billy Reinhart. This is the phishing email that was sent on March 22nd, and this catches Billy Reinhart, and because he opens up this phishing email at 4 a.m. in his hotel room, and he changes his email. He thinks he's changing his email password, but he's giving Fancy Bear his credentials. Okay, let's keep on going. On April 6th, apparently Fancy Bear had gotten some good information from these emails. They kind of figured out who's working for whom, and so they send poisoned attachments to campaign officials. That is, they send an Excel spreadsheet that has buried within it malware, and they get a bunch of people to click on this poisoned attachment, and they snag somebody from the DCCC, which is the Democratic Congressional Caucus, I don't know, something like that, but some congressional focused Democratic group. But the DCC shared the same offices with the DNC. And so when Fancy Bear penetrated the DCC network, they were also able to get a person who also worked for the DNC to get their credentials and to get into the DNC. I should say also, April 15th, Fancy Bear exfiltrates documents from the DCC. And then on April 18th, Fancy Bear penetrates the DNC. You see, this is like what's called the kill chain. You know, what happens is you do reconnaissance, figure out who's whom, then you make initial intrusions, you move laterally, you escalate privileges, and you work your way through networks, hopping here to there, to try to get to where you want to get to. And so they get to the DNC, and they exfiltrate lots and lots and lots, over a gigabyte of data, and they keep it. The DNC notices suspicious activity. They notice that somebody has access to various user password vaults, and they call CrowdStrike, which cybersecurity firm working with the DNC. They realize at this point that they have an intrusion. Okay. In May, CrowdStrike discovers that not only Fancy Bear, but Cozy Bear is in the Democratic National Committee. Cozy Bear is another hacking unit, either the FSB or the SVR, either two different alternative Russian intelligence agencies. The Cozy Bear had been in the DNC for about a year by the time CrowdStrike discovers this. The FBI also knows about Cozy Bear, and so we'll talk about like why is everyone not freaking out that not only Fancy Bear got into the DNC, but Cozy Bear, another Russian intelligence agency, has been in the DNC for about a year. The Washington Post posted an article on the DNC hack on June 14th. June 15th, this sock puppet, Guccifer 2.0, posts documents on this website which they put up called DC Leaks, and they send the information also over to this website, Smoking Gun. On July 18th, who's ever in control of this information, obviously Fancy Bear, sends it over to WikiLeaks, announces that it has a gigabyte of information which is going to post. And on July 22nd, when Hillary Clinton announces that she's picked her running mate, Tim Kaine, that night on Twitter, WikiLeaks releases it in the morning. And this is the tweet. 19,252 emails from the US Democratic National Committee, WikiLeaks. And they start putting all these emails up on a searchable database on WikiLeaks. Okay. Reasons to think that this was the Russians. Well, firstly, Guccifer 2.0. Guccifer was a Romanian hacker. Guccifer 2.0 claims that he is also Romanian. A cybersecurity journalist starts addressing them. I'll keep on calling him in Romanian, and it's pretty clear that Guccifer 2.0 can't speak Romanian, just using Google Translate. Other issues, security researchers start looking at the metadata, and they start seeing, last modified by somebody. It's in the Russian and Cyrillic. This is Iron Felix, the founder of the KGB. Obviously, this is a pseudonym of the Russian hacker, because Iron Felix has been long dead. People also notice that when some of the documents, the links fail to resolve, when it's on the Guccifer 2.0's servers, they get the error message in Russian, and when they do it on DC Leaks, it resolves in English. Again, making you think that it's the Russians. But really, the smoking gun here is that SecureWorks found 19,000 links. Let me back up for a second. So Bitly, as you may know, is a URL shortening service, and the Fancy Bear took all of the links that they were using for phishing, and they shortened them using Bitly URL shorteners. The person who created the Bitly account, though, from Fancy Bear, did not actually do the right thing and set the account to private. So all of Fancy Bear's activities, all 19,000 links targeting 4,800 accounts, were public. And through a lot of hard work, the AP and SecureWorks showed that this link constituted a detailed documentary record of Fancy Bear's hacking operations from March 2015 to May 2016, including all the attacked email accounts of Hillary for America, the DCC, the DNC, and prominent politicians. So first, I mean, it's almost impossible for somebody to have done this and then impersonated Fancy Bear. It clearly had to have been Fancy Bear who did this. When the Washington Post article came out, the DNC chairperson, Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz, said the security of our systems is critical to our operations, confidence of the campaigns and state parties we work with. When we discovered the intrusion, we treated this like the serious incident, reached out to CrowdStrike immediately. Our team moved as quickly as possible to kick out the intruders and secure our network. Well, no, that did not happen at all. The CrowdStrike had discovered this in May. They waited for a bit. They waited till June 14th to clean the Russians out of the DNC network, in part because the Democratic National Convention was in May, and they didn't want to have to wipe the entire network and reinstall everything when they were preparing for the convention. What's super interesting and super difficult for people to explain is that not only does the DNC wait a whole month and a half before kicking out the Russians, but the FBI had known about Cozy Bear for about a year, and since September of 2015 was like contacting the DNC in very kind of cryptic ways, telling them that they should check their networks. They wouldn't exactly tell them who was in there. They would say you've been hacked. You should look at something called the Dukes. The DNC has no idea what the Dukes is. It turns out the Dukes is the FBI's name for Cozy Bear. And it takes a long time up until February for even the FBI to meet with the DNC to tell them, give them even more information so they can find Cozy Bear, which they can't find until they find Fancy Bear in April. So why does it take at the FBI so long to tell the DNC that the Russians are in their networks? But number two, why is the DNC, they don't freak out when the FBI contacts them in September. They kind of take it in stride. And when they meet in February, they increase their investigations, but they're not really that freaked out. They even wait a month and a half between the time that they discover Fancy Bear in the DNC networks and the time they kick them out. So what's going on? Like, what's going on here? And I think the tempting thing is to say that everyone's incompetent, that nobody knows what they're doing. The DNC was incompetent. The FBI was incompetent. When the Russians are in your network, how is that not a 5-alarm fire? Okay, so here's the point. Let's just go over the upcode. Okay, first thing, espionage is legal according to international law. Okay, that's the first thing. States are allowed under international law to spy on each other. Okay, number two, states hack each other all the time. We're in their systems, they're in our systems. Intelligence services go after hard targets first, then soft targets. Both Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear have been going after hard targets for a long time. They went after the White House, they went after the Pentagon, they went after the State Department. They were running out of targets. They went after the DNC and Hillary for America because they were going after everyone. They were going after Brookings. They were going after political science departments. They were just looking for anything they could get their hands on because they couldn't get into the harder targets. DNC was a soft target, so they went after that. They thought, okay, let's see what we can get from there. Dog bites man. If you're the DNC, you kind of expect that nation state hackers are going to try to hack you. The fact that they get into your network, that's not like a good thing. It's a bad thing, but it's not the end of the world, because okay, so they learn about what your political strategies are. They keep it to themselves. Nation states tend not to spy and then tell everyone about it, but that of course changes. But the DNC and the FBI, they're like, the FBI is going around telling people various soft targets, you got hacked. And the DNC is like, yeah, we got hacked. Okay, like, what are we going to do about it? On the other hand, the FBI is a hybrid organization. It's half counterintelligence, half law enforcement. That means that that when the FBI was contacting the DNC probably wasn't sure why they were contacting them. Remember that the FBI had a criminal investigation of Hillary's emails. The DNC must have thought, because they were contacted by the law enforcement part of the FBI, not by the counterintelligence part of the FBI, they probably thought that the FBI was trying to get information on Hillary's emails. FBI prosecutors are not allowed to lie, but FBI agents are allowed to lie. So basically what you have is the FBI and the DNC, on the one hand, they're not happy that the Russians are in the networks of the DNC, but it's kind of not that surprising. Number two, the DNC is not that crazy about talking to the FBI, because they're worried that anything they say to the FBI is going to be used against Hillary Clinton. And so the fact that it takes them so long to get together, really, from both of their perspectives, is a pretty rational thing. But then everything changes. What changes? Fancy Bear changes the rules of geopolitics. They didn't just keep the information, they released and weaponized it. This took everyone by surprise. This was a change in state practice. And that raises the question, was this just espionage or was this war? The point that I'd like to just end on is to say that when Russia was preparing to invade Ukraine, the United States government didn't just hack Russia and spy on Russia, but they did what Fancy Bear did. They released the information. They kept on saying to the world, we know that the Russians are going to invade Ukraine. So what goes around comes around. Change the upcode, Fancy Bear. The FBI, the intelligence community of the United States, may use it against Russia, and they did. So I'm going to stop here and take questions.
Thank you so much, Scott. So for all those in the audience, the way that we'll manage questions, if you could just drop the questions into the question box in the Q&A box, it's called, in Zoom, then I'll play the role of moderating and pass those questions on to our guest. So
should I stop sharing?
Yeah, please, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay.
Excellent. So I thought maybe something we could add to this discussion, because it's somewhat relevant, is in your book, in the introduction to your book, you talk a little bit about how you decided to write this book. And if you could go into that a little bit, because you say you did the book because, quote, much of what is said about hacking is either wrong, misleading, or exaggerated. But what got you personally to the stage where you wrote this book, being a law professor, being someone with a PhD in philosophy, not actually somebody who otherwise was involved in cybersecurity and computers and computer science and all that sort of thing?
Yeah, so one of the things that you learn when you write a book is that nobody ever asks you about the book you wrote. they ask you about the new thing. So when we wrote the book, Oona Hathaway and I wrote the Internationalists, which was a history of the legality of war from 1600 to 2014. Everyone kept on asking us about, okay, well, what about the future of war? What about cyber war? And I thought to myself, well, I should be able to figure this out because I actually had a very strong coding background. I was a coder for 10 years. I had my own computer company. I was a computer science major in college. I had done research in theoretical computer science. So I thought I could figure this out. Turned out I couldn't. Well, I mean, I eventually did, but it was really, really hard. Cybersecurity is a kind of young field. There's not like books that will explain it to generally educated people about how it actually works. Cybersecurity books either are kind of eat your vegetables, kind of boring, staid, making you feel bad because your password has your pet's name in it, or it's we're all gonna die, kind of breathless, like just overblown stuff, the same stuff that we hear about AI now. And I wanted to write a book that was explained how hacking works, how cybersecurity works, do it in a context that people could read. So a lot of it is a kind of has a true crime storytelling aspect to it. And I wanted them to be able to understand the world in which they live in. I mean, it's kind of ironic that like we live in an information society and we are all quintessential knowledge workers, but we kind of don't know how our information society works, how the internet works, and how it can be subverted, how our information is stored, manipulated, and transferred. And that I kind of wanted to explain it because I thought if I can't understand it, my Lord, how does anyone else understand it? And then as I started writing it, I realized that actually the technical stuff, although extremely important to understand things, is the least important part of it. What's really important is the human aspect, how people get tricked into things, the bad incentives that software companies have when they develop software, the weird rules that we have about espionage, the weird kinds of organizations like the FBI, which is a hybrid organization, all these kind of weird things that people ignore, but are really doing so much of the work. So that really was why I wrote the book. I would just say, what's a law professor writing a book about cybersecurity? Well, law professors and lawyers are the quintessential upcoders. We develop upcode. And if upcode determines downcode, then, a law professor should write it.
One very helpful aspect of your upcode and downcode distinction is that we're all using devices all the time, and yet very few of us, if we're not truly experts, have the faintest idea as to how they work and the intricacies of a term like coding and all the things that go on. But that happens to be true for most of the machines that we engage with in the world. We don't really have to know a lot about cars to drive them. We don't need to know a lot about the electrical grid to turn on lights. So one very hopeful element of your book is the suggestion that the domain that we're generally more comfortable working in, that is to say, figuring out how to talk about things, how to manage our lives, how to engage with our security questions, at least to the degree we can, that's actually a domain where our actions and our focus is best directed. So, I'm sorry?
No, I said, yeah, I was just agreeing with you. Yes.
Yeah, so that's a very hopeful message of the book, and I'm wondering how you would translate that message or communicate that message to the world of people deeply frightened by cybersecurity, since there really are few elements of the term cybersecurity for the non-expert that don't sound frightening.
Yeah, that's right. So what you do is you write a book with a title called Fancy Bear Goes Phishing that just sounds like a children's book. and the cover has got like almost like a cartoon bear on it. The book is like there's just a lot of comical, crazy things that happen, and lots of people report to me that um, you know, that they feel like the book tricked them into learning things, which is what like we try to do as teachers, is try to get people interested enough in the subject by figuring out ways of framing it so that they don't think to themselves, oh my God, I can't do this, but rather, oh wow, oh that's how it works. Oh, that's not that complicated. Um, and so what 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 originally the book was supposed to be called Insecurity, because I wanted to get across the idea that not only are our digital systems insecure, but we are insecure about our own lack of knowledge. But it was deemed, Fancy Bear Goes Phishing was deemed a more publishable title. And so the idea is you have to meet people where they are, and people like to read about true crime. They like to read stories which have a whodunit aspect to it, and when you can slip in like real information, that's the trick. And I don't know if I succeeded, but that was the plan.
We have a question here from Kara Gardner. Based on your comments, it seems that standards regarding cyber espionage are now changing internationally. How do you expect that this change will impact cybersecurity moving forward? And do you think this could lead to changing international law regarding the legalities of espionage?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a really good question. As I had mentioned um, at the end of my comments, I do think that the rules are changing. That is, now it seems kind of normal to hack into a system, get the information, and then release it to the world, which is hack and leaks. Or like not a normal thing to do. And you know, Fancy Bear showed the way of how to what we now call weaponize information. The really interesting question is, so we have cyber espionage, and that's espionage is the spying, the collection of classified confidential information, and normally used to inform political decision making of the spyer. Now, what do we do in those situations where instead of just using the information for your own internal purposes, you release it to the world and you try to change facts on the ground? Does that count as cyber war? Have we moved from espionage into war by not just consuming internally the fruits of espionage, but using it in a weaponized form in the way that Fancy Bear did it, and the way in which the United States has done it vis-a-vis Russia? My own view, and I'm happy to talk about this more, is that it's an enormous mistake to try to apply the rules of cyber war, of the laws of war, to the cyber realm. Even though people do it all the time. I mean, there's a giant project called the Talon Manual that, you know, it's in the second version, probably go to a third version. Huge project to try to apply the laws of war to cyber. That seems to me like a big mistake, because the laws of war are regulate a very different form of security, which is physical security. And what we're dealing with is information security. And that does not mean that hacking and then releasing the information is now legal. But it does mean, I think it's illegal, and I can talk about why I think it's illegal, but it doesn't constitute an act of war, because war simply doesn't apply in these kinds of cases. It's just a very different model of security, and the project going forward is to come up with rules that make sense for these kinds of situations where what's being manipulated and weaponized is information as opposed to bombs, tanks, and ground troops.
So you brought up a very interesting question, which is what does war mean in a circumstance where we have a new domain? So traditionally, we've had the domain of land, the domain of sea, the domain of space was added not that relatively recently. The domain of air, frankly, is relatively recent in the world of war. We've applied basically the same laws of war to these domains, with space a little bit odd in its various ways. But cyber is a new domain. We have a cyber command. So we have an understanding, we have the mobilization of the Department of Defense to engage cyber. And then, of course, there's cyber elements within the other services. And yet, if the law of war is not the concept of war is not the proper way to understand that threat and the mechanism of aggression, how can it be processed so that the elements of state power can enable the protection of the state? Something has to be a violation, and that violation has to trigger some kind of meaningful response. So what's the right way to conceptualize attacks in the cyber domain that can do substantive harm? We're not talking about ordinary crime or the annoyance of perhaps certain kinds of cyber attack, but something far more substantive that threatens the security of the nation.
Yeah, no, thank you for asking that. So the first thing I want to say is I'm not saying that cyber war is a contradiction in terms. Um, uh, I'm perfectly happy to accept that there could be a cyber war. I think, and I'll talk about this, I just think it's much to do about nothing. Cyber weapons are weapons of the weak. And cyber war is what happens when weak nations don't actually want to drop bombs and engage in kinetic activities. But let's remember that, like, international law regulates conflict between states that don't involve war. So there's the norm of non-intervention. That is, you're not allowed to mess around in the internal affairs of another state. That doesn't mean that you've engaged in an act of war, but it does mean that if you do engage in interference in the domestic affairs of the state, that you're engaging in not only just an illegal activity, but a highly illegal activity. That doesn't mean that you violated Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, or that it triggers Article 51, the Act of Self-Defense. What it does mean is that there are certain reprisals, certain countermeasures that are appropriate in these sorts of situations. So I want to make kind of three claims. One is that cyber war, we should kind of stop talking about it almost. It's just not that important a phenomenon. I mean, it's an interesting phenomenon, but it's just not like what it's been made. It's not the future of war. That's the first thing. The second thing is that international law has ways of regulating interference by states that don't involve war. And in particular, we have the norm of non-interference. And it seems to me that what Fancy Bear did and what the United States did, let me just say, certainly what Fancy Bear did was a violation of the norm of non-interference. What the United States did very well could be part of some type of notion of protecting states against aggression, which might be an appropriate form of interference. But scholars need to be thinking in these terms and stop taking rules that were made for the physical destructive realm of traditional kinetic war and trying to shoehorn that into this very different kind of conflict in cyberspace.
What do you think about the concept of harm? because obviously the physical is a particular realm, and cyber actions might have a physical impact if they, create an explosion somewhere or whatever they do. But traditionally, we've understood war to be the most extreme level of a physical projection of power, where the physicality has to do uh, ultimately about harm and suffering as a way of projecting power, right? So,
Right.
so it's quite possible now to create a great deal of harm, and we can talk about like what would constitute that level of harm. Would undermining a democracy count as a form of harm for which there needs to be a response, or would it have to be something, as Tom Manuel talks about, trying to engage, you know, an analogous harm related to what kinetic activity would do. But what's the harm? What's the way to conceptualize harm so that it would adequately enable a state's response to cyber operations at a level that threatens security?
Yeah. So let me first say that um, certainly if with cyber physical links, there are exploits that lead to kinetic effects. Clearly, that would count as, if it rose to the level of an act of war if done by bombs, it should rise to the level of war if done via computers, right? So, like, that's the least interesting thing about
Right.
cyber. The fact that, like, now we have a new weapon to do what bombs can do. What's so fascinating about cyber is that we can do things that bombs can never do, which is affect the information security of a state. Like I said, because there are norms of non-interference, and the violations of of international norms typically give rise to countermeasures. There are ways in which states are empowered to retaliate. Whether they're able to retaliate kinetically, as you say, really would depend on the the level of harm. I find it unbelievably unlikely that you could ever say that a cyber attack like so severely undermined democracy that that rose to the level of war, precisely because, well, if it's that easy to undermine democracy, um, then you didn't have much of a democracy to begin with. And that's often when I think about disinformation, all the stuff about disinformation is that these things are poking at existing vulnerabilities that are internal to the political society. But what if there was change in the integrity to the banking system? Wow, that's, like, if you affected the integrity of the banking system of a country, that could lead to the collapse of that economy, that state. And at that point, I don't know what I would say. I mean, you raise a really good question, but the question should be, uh, rather than saying that this is an Article 2.4 violation, we should be thinking about what would be the appropriate responses to a kind of interference that is so egregious, that international law has to give states the right to do something about it.
But part of the carve out for espionage is that spies are not protected by the protected elements of the laws of war. And it's constructed as this space that sort of exists in some poorly constructed realm of accountability,
Yeah,
secret, under the radar. But because we live in a world where all of us are, at all institutions, whether they're banks, whether they're universities, whether they're hospital systems, power grid, they're all vulnerable in a way that really was unimaginable in the relatively recent past. So even if it's true that the worst visions of a sort of cyber apocalypse may be unlikely or even impossible, it still seems like we don't have a way of conceptualizing the risks associated with cyber attacks um, that gives us the language to respond. If cyber war is sort of takes us in the wrong direction, what would be the right direction?
Yeah, so like I said, I think it's really about developing the norm of non-interference.
Uh-huh.
That there's a jurisprudence around that norm. It's relatively undeveloped, in part because everyone always looks at war,
Yep.
and that I think is a mistake. Instead of trying to shoehorn things into a body of rules which are very well developed but are not actually applicable, we should be developing the norms that do exist and that do apply in these cases, so that we can answer a lot of these questions. I would just say, push back. I know people say these things about why there's a carve out for spying.
Yeah.
But I think the reason why spying is allowed is because it's good, to the overall health of the international system. That is, it is really good that states know about the aggressive intentions of other states. Um, there is this thing called the security dilemma, which is that you always have to assume that, because aggressive buildup, um, any kind of buildup can be seen as being both aggressive or defensive. Um, the, my my hypothesis is that international law recognizes that it's really good for states to be able to check whether it's aggressive or whether it's defensive. And so my yeah,
So would you think, I mean, this is an interesting point because it would suggest that never, with the advent of the information age and cyber connections, the internet, we now have a capacity, various actors, particularly powerful actors with great resources, have the ability to know things about aggressors, potential aggressors, other states that were really, really difficult to understand in the past. So would you think then, would you posit that this cybersecurity world we live in with its pressing fears and worries may well produce a safer environment in that it's likely or more likely that states have a greater understanding of what aggressors are up to. The case of U.S. and allies' knowledge of Russian activities in the Ukraine is a pretty compelling one in that we know just from public reporting how much was the U.S. was aware of.
yeah, I mean um, it's really hard to know, um, how the thing ultimately balances out, because I mean, if you're Ukraine, you don't love the fact that maybe Russia knows about your defensive
Sure.
activities. But I do think that, the hypothesis you're mentioning is a very plausible one. That is, it's really hard to keep secrets in this world, and it's really, it's not terrible if, we cut down on the spaces of possible Pearl Harbor type attacks, just because it's really, really hard to pull off surprise attacks anymore. And you just have to assume that nation states kind of know what's going on, and that probably has a disciplining, um, effect.
How about the other side, though, of cyber war? Even if you don't like the term, which is there's a rapidity, there's a speed at which potential attacks could take place, and a difficulty of attribution in many cases that those in the cyber command and those in that world are constantly talking about, which is how can you create a system that's adequately responsive given a new element of the domain, which is even if it might be difficult to hide secrets, it's now possible to levy attacks and for things to occur at a speed where it's difficult to respond appropriately if you're not sure of attribution and just the intensity of the circumstance
Yeah.
is hard for human beings to respond to quickly, right?
Yeah, I know. People say that all the time, and I guess I'm not sure what they're talking about. Look at the Fancy Bear thing. I mean, like, it took them, from March 10th to April 18th to get April 22nd to get that information out of the DNC. It wasn't like that. And you know, offensive operations are very quick, but so are defensive operations, right? I mean, people talk about AI. I mean, we've been using AI for over a decade to police intrusions into systems. So, offense happens really quickly, defense happens really quickly. And I tend to think that, this idea of, well, just somebody could be at their keyboard and just hit a couple of things and then just bedlam happens is not really the way these things truly work. Hacking is a long, torturous process with many missteps, many. I mean, I told you right before we got on the webinar that when I teach cybersecurity and I teach students how to hack, one of the messages I want to get across them is nothing ever works. It's like it's really, really hard to do cyber operations at scale. And so I tend to think that, again, I may be wrong, but right now I'm not seeing the kinds of operations that people worry about, and I may very well be wrong. And if I am, then we'll try to figure out how to respond. But anything you do to the United States that might be really quick, well, the United States not only can do it back because we're the greatest hackers in the world, but we got bombs and we got tanks, and anybody that does something that really hurts the United States is going to unleash not cyber response, but like a kinetic response. So that's again why I think, like, when you're serious, you go kinetic. When you're playing around, or when you're harassing, when you're trying to irritate, that's when you use pure cyber. I guess that's my sense from sitting here right now.
Well, Scott Shapiro, thank you so much. That was really illuminating. The book is a great read for those who want to look up. It's not an academic book by any means. It's a trade press book, and reads that way. It does provide a real insight, and also, as I think was communicated pretty clearly, has a very different view of the cybersecurity threat and the issue of how dangerous cyber is, and the usefulness of terms like cyber war. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. Thank you, Scott, and wish you all a good night.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and bye-bye, everyone.